Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. Today we are continuing our look at the maritime empires of the time period 1450 to 1750. But today specifically we're looking at the Iberian Empires, so called because they originate from the Iberian Peninsula, that is to say Portuguese and Spanish colonies. So if we take a quick look at this map, what I want you to notice here, the green areas are like territories of land that are controlled by the Portuguese. You'll notice along the coastline of both West and East Africa, and obviously Brazil and the Americas. But then you will also notice a bunch of like red dots, and those were ports that were occupied by the Portuguese. Excuse me. Particularly in the Indian Ocean and in Southeast and East Asia. They had a particular strategy that they were pursuing that explains that. We'll get to that in just a moment. So again, the main thing driving them is they're looking for a way to get to Asia. And so in their earlier explorations, they're using gunpowder to conquer territory along the coastline, especially ports. Once they get to the Indian Ocean, after Da Gama is able to establish that route, what they're focusing on are certain areas known as choke points, places where there has to be a lot of shipping traffic to go through. So these include places that you will probably recognize, most especially Malacca over in Southeast Asia, because anybody going from East Asia into the Indian Ocean or vice versa has to go through there. So that's where they're going to focus their attention. And the reason for this is what they're trying to establish in the Indian Ocean and all throughout Asia is what's known as a trading post empire. We saw this before, if you remember, in the ancient period. This is sort of what the Phoenicians did in the Mediterranean, and later Greek colonies did the same thing. But they're basically focusing on key ports, not like taking over vast chunks of land and then trying to use those to link together a maritime empire in the truest sense of the word. But what's an interesting take, a kind of novel take on this, is how are you going to actually profit on that? How are you going to make money? Well, the system they come up with is something known as the Cartaz Pass. And the idea is this, that anybody who wants to go through their choke points has to buy a pass, a ticket basically that gives you admission through their territory. So they're not actually making money off of anything except charging people for going through the choke points that they control. The system works for a while, but not for very long. And there's several good reasons for this, but the first of which is the Indian Ocean is huge. And there's so many merchants from so many different states and territories that it's almost impossible to really, like, how do you make everybody buy a pass? There are always going to be people who don't and manage to do it. Moreover, these Portuguese sailors are men who are alone, and once they've been there for a while, many of them start to marry local women, and this is particularly true in East Africa and in Southeast Asia. And so these Portuguese men who originally are there just as sailors, they end up settling down, getting married, having families, and they are less interested in trying to, make everybody pay for a pass. They've got their own family in these territories that are not originally part of the trading post empire. Moreover, as we'll see tomorrow, the Dutch and the English in particular are really trying to take over whatever it is that the Portuguese control in Asia. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow, but that competition is definitely a detriment to the Portuguese. In fact, they're not going to be able to keep up at all. So then that takes us to the Americas. Portuguese Brazil, like what the heck are they going to do with this territory? If you remember, The territory is essentially rainforest in the Amazon basin, and there's no giant civilization already there of natives. There are natives there, obviously, but most of them are hunter-gatherers who live in still these small sort of Paleolithic societies. So what are they going to do with all of this land? Well, their approach is to give it to the Portuguese nobility. And what is going on here is really kind of unusual because those nobles who have these giant chunks of land and they're not sure what to do with it, their idea is, well, let's cut down the trees and use it for sugar production. You can think of it as a kind of like joining of feudalism, that idea of giving land for loyalty, combined with commercial agriculture, with large scale plantations that are exclusively focused on a cash crop. A consequence of this, though, again, there's not many natives. There's no giant civilization there. So how are they going to get the labor to do this? Well, they're going to bring slaves from Africa. By 1700, more than half of all the people that are in Portuguese Brazil are directly from Africa. We'll talk more about this later on, but that's a really, really big turning point right there. In the 18th century, then, there is a discovery of gold, which leads to a kind of gold rush. But the thing about it is, the profits from that gold are used to produce more sugar, and it's not used to increase manufacturing. Portuguese Brazil is not making anything to sell to anybody else, nor are they taking that gold and taking it back to Portugal, where in Portugal they're making something to sell to somebody else. This is a big deal that we'll come back to at the end of the week, because as we'll see, those countries that are doing that are the ones that are in the long run going to be more successful. So by 1800, then, the price of Brazilian sugar is declining. Brazil for a century is just dominating sugar production throughout the world. But over time, increasingly, other empires, as we'll see, are growing sugar in the Caribbean and doing so much more profitably. But if you look at the larger economics of it, and it's kind of a shameful thing to do, but it's the reality. If everybody else is trying to grow sugar too, and they all need African slaves for the labor, the price of slaves is going up because everybody needs them. But at the same time, there's so much sugar that the price is going down. And so the bottom line, what's happening in Portuguese Brazil, they kind of put all their eggs in one basket: sugar. Sugar was everything. That's all they did, and it was great until it no longer really became that profitable for them. They had nothing else to fall back on. Now, I really want to make sure you understand how much it sucks to work in a sugar plantation. So here's the deal. First of all, you've got to harvest this plant, and it's a really, really big member of the grass family, okay? It's hard to actually harvest it. And of course, there's no machines to harvest it at this point, so you have to do it by hand. Then you have to take those plants and grind them up and extract the juice. Now, this is an early windmill that's used to do that, but most of the time it would have to be done by hand. However the juice is extracted, it's then collected, and then you take that juice and you boil it off. The water evaporates, and what's left is crystallized sugar, what we think of as actual sugar. But again, I really want you to understand how horrible this work is. People die routinely in sugar production. It's one of the reasons why, as we'll see when we get to this next week, it's one of the reasons why the volume of trade in human beings is so high, because so many of them are dying so young that they're not actually living long enough to produce more children who would then be part of the slave labor force. Again, it's a tough thing to really get your mind around, but it's also the reality that it's so many people are dying that they constantly have to keep feeding the labor force by importing slaves directly from Africa. Now, let's look on the other hand at the Spanish Empire. One thing I want you to notice is in the Americas, first of all, if you look at the territory that becomes part of Spanish America, much of it was occupied previously by large civilizations, especially in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs, and in the Andes, the Inca. But then the other thing to notice is, with the exception of the Philippines in Asia, there's not a whole lot of Spanish presence. And there's a specific reason for that that we'll get to here in just a moment. But let's first talk about the method, the means of Spanish conquest, okay? The key thing in Spanish America was the conquistadors. These are guys who are from a particular, most of them from a particular region of Spain, and they're there on a mission. And their mission, in their own mind, God, gold, and glory. They're there for religious reasons. They're there to get gold for their country and then in turn get glory for themselves. Now, again, the degree to which that's in fact what they were doing is debatable, but in their own mind, that's what is fueling their conquest. Now, the two biggies that we're going to look at specifically in class for the next 3 days. Cortez is the guy who defeats the Aztecs. Their leader, Montezuma, and this giant empire is toppled with only 600 conquistadors. That is a really remarkable fact. How does that happen? We'll look at that much more closely in class. Similarly, if you notice, 12 years later is when Pizarro conquers the Incas, and they're great, the Sapa Inca Atahualpa, and they only have 200 conquistadors. How is it that within the span of 15 years, and by the way, the order of that is important, as we'll see, how is it that so few Spanish are able to topple these giant empires? We'll come back to that again in specifically throughout the rest of the week in class, but part of that is going to involve, again, Jared Diamond's thesis, Guns, Germs, and Steel, that it had much more to do with geographical consequences than it did with cultural ones. So that's what we'll be focusing on for the next couple of days in class. But for right now, let's focus on, after the conquest of Spanish America, how is their economy working? We know in Portuguese Brazil, everything was based in sugar, but it's a much different situation in Spanish America, where mining is definitely what is driving the economy of the Spanish territories in the Americas. Now, originally, they're looking for gold, and they get a great deal of gold, but eventually, silver becomes known as the heart of the Spanish Empire. It's really about silver. The largest mine in the world, Potosi, which is in modern Bolivia, is discovered. And as I mentioned before, it's far bigger than anything that is anywhere else in the world, much larger than the one that's discovered in Japan at about the same time. But it's also the case that there are mines all throughout their silver mines all throughout their territory. Now, in order to get all of this silver, though, they're going to use coercive labor. Now, in a situation different than the sugar plantations, however, they have large native populations that they're going to use for their labor force. And initially, the way this works is something called the encomienda system. The encomienda system states that if a territory of land is granted, it's usually a conquistador or a lord from Spain, they own everything on that land, including the people. So native people can be forced to work because they are literally owned by the person who now owns the land. The problem with this, as we'll see more closely on Friday, the abuses of this system were so horrible that many of the Jesuit priests are writing letters back to the King of Spain like, this is absolutely appalling. We cannot do this. And so there's an attempt to sort of modify that system called repartimiento, which is a kind of a modification, if you will. The encomienda system is essentially still in place, except for now there's rules about how you have to treat the natives who are the labor force. Now, in theory, this sounds really good, but these regulations are quite hard to actually impose, and so there's some debate about to what extent did this actually make working conditions better for the natives. Nonetheless, um, if you remember in the Inca Empire, they had a labor system called the Mita system. And that was where the conquered peoples were required to give a certain number of weeks every year of labor as a kind of tribute to the Sapa Inca. What the Spanish do in the Inca territory is they simply modify that and say, well, it's the same system. It's just now that you got to do that labor for us. And instead of doing it a couple of weeks every year, how about we just do it, all the time? But there's a system in place, and so they just modify it and twist it to their own advantage. But unlike what happened in Portuguese Brazil, the Spanish did not put all of their proverbial eggs in one basket, and so there was a deliberate attempt to focus on agricultural production in Spanish America. They use something for this called the hacienda system, and it's kind of like a plantation, but the biggest difference is that it's focusing on food production, whether that's crops or in many cases ranching. So like an early form of cowboy emerges, the gauchos, these ranchers who are bringing cattle from the old world into the new world and focusing on growing beef, having a stable food supply. One of the problems with this, though, even though it's much more diversified than Portuguese Brazil, there's very little focus on manufacturing. Again, in Spanish America, they're producing raw materials. They're producing enough food, more than enough food, in fact, a surplus of food, but they're not actually making things to sell to other people. And what's more, as we'll see, that silver that's going back to the crown in Spain, that is also not being used to manufacture things to sell to others. Again, that's a big idea we'll get to later on in the week. In terms of the politics of the Spanish colonies, the way that system works is there was a Council of the Indies, it was called, and this was like the overall governing board, if you will, of the Spanish territory in the Americas, and it was divided up into 4 viceroyalties, which, if you can see on the map, New Spain, which is basically Mesoamerica, New Granada, Peru, which is essentially what was the Inca Empire, and La Plata. This system was copied by the by the Portuguese in Brazil, although not quite so successfully run, as we'll see later on. Those viceroyalties are then subdivided into what are known as royal audiencias, and then those are subdivided into local magistrates. And so it's a hierarchy that is structured to try to keep control of the crown in Spain in this new territory that is literally, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. But if you take a quick look at this map, you will notice the viceroyalty of Brazil is intruding there on the viceroyalty of Peru. And there's constant conflict between Spain and Portugal over who controls what in the Americas. And those conflicts are eventually settled by 2 big treaties that you need to know. The first of these, the Treaty of Tordesillas, establishes a line in the Americas that separates Portuguese from Spanish territory. And then a later one, the Treaty of Saragossa, establishes a line in Asia over who gets what. Although, as we'll see, that doesn't quite work out that way. So here's a map of these treaties. And the first thing you'll notice is there is a dotted line. This was an attempt by the Pope. I should point out as well, remember that Portugal and Spain are both Catholic nations. Again, we'll come back to this later on, but they are Catholic nations, and so they both view, sort of the Pope as the leader of their faith. So the Pope sort of intercedes and he draws a line, but it turns out that his maps are pretty crappy and his line totally misses the mark. So that line is revised in the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is the solid purple line. And according to that line, everything to the right of it belongs to Portugal, everything to the left of that line belongs to Spain. But then, of course, the problem is the Earth is round. Like, how do you figure that out if you just extend, to the left? Isn't like all of Asia to the left of the solid purple line? So another treaty, the Treaty of Saragossa, is established. But if you will notice on the solid green line, the original purpose for that was there was a feud between Spain and Portuguese over the Malaccan Islands, which are spice islands in Southeast Asia. They're not the same as Malacca. Malacca is actually right here, but the Spanish and Portuguese called these the Malaccan Islands. Now they're known as Indonesia, but we'll come back to that later on. The point is this: if you look at this line, most of the Philippines is actually in what is supposed to be Portuguese territory. The purpose of these lines is anything in between here belongs to Portugal. Anything in between here to here, if you could imagine spinning the globe around, is supposed to belong to the Spanish. However, the Portuguese just have no interest in the Philippines, and as we'll see, they're going to start weakening pretty severely, and so the Spanish are simply going to take the Philippines by force, and there's really nothing that the Portuguese can do about it, or do they want to do anything about it, because as far as they're concerned, it has no value to them. Now, these in turn then are what we call the Iberian Maritime Empires. Again, they come from the Iberian Peninsula. Here's Portugal, their maritime empire in blue. Here's Spain, theirs in red. Now, there's one thing that they share in common, even as they're, especially in the Americas, their sort of approach is different. Portuguese Brazil is an empire of sugar. Spanish America is more based on silver mining, but with some agricultural production. But one thing they both share is the emergence of a brand spanking new type of social hierarchy that is in both Spanish and Portuguese Brazil, Spanish America and Portuguese Brazil, known as the Society of the Castes. In fact, our English word caste, comes originally from the Portuguese word castas, which was the word they used to describe the system that they saw in India. But what's unusual about this social hierarchy in the context of world history is this is the first time that the social hierarchy is based exclusively on race. It's all about race. And if you notice, the image that you've got that you're going to label is in black and white, but if you look at the screen, white is on top, and the darker you are, the lower down you go. So here's how this worked. Obviously, white people are at the top of this social hierarchy, but at the very top are people known as peninsulares. Peninsulares are not just white people, but they're white people born in Iberia. I repeat, peninsulares are born in the Iberian Peninsula. So you got to be born in Spain or Portugal to be at the top of the social hierarchy in the Americas. Now below them are also white people, 100% white, but they're known as Creoles. Now, a lot of people think the word Creole means a mixing of things. That may be true for cooking, but it's not true in race and social hierarchy. Creoles are 100% white, but they are born in the Americas. So think about this now. You could be white, 100% Spanish blood, let's say. But if your daddy was, a Peninsulare, and then you are born in the Americas, even if your mom was also a Peninsulare, you are a Creole, and you are below the Peninsulares. This is going to have a big impact, as we'll see later on, because it's kind of odd. Somebody just off the boat from Portugal is now in a more, superior social position than you, and you've been there for 2 or 3 generations. An odd situation, but again, it has to do with the purity. You're more pure somehow if you're born on the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, so now let's jump down to the bottom, okay? At the bottom, you have the Native Americas, which in this system are referred to as Indios. And then you also have, especially in Portuguese Brazil and throughout the Caribbean. Oh, I'm sorry, let me back up. So you got Indios, who are Native Americans, and then in between are the mestizos. Mestizo means a mix of Native American and European. Okay? Now, the mestizos and Indios are much more common in Spanish America, particularly New Spain and Peru, those viceroyalties. But in the Portuguese Brazil and throughout the Caribbean, over half of the population, in some cases almost all of the population, are African slaves. Literally from Africa, not born in the Americas, because they're dying so fast, they're constantly coming from Africa. But the word for those people who are like part African, part European, are mulattoes. Now, here's something I want to point out. Actually, I should just go to this. They even had a category if you were like half Indio and half Negro, then you were a Zambo. And again, these terms I know can kind of seem uncomfortable. They make me a little uncomfortable. Those were the terms that were used by both the Spanish and the Portuguese at the time. Here's the thing I want to point out, though. First, this is so significant because of its direct, explicit linking of race to the social hierarchy. Even in places like, the caste system in India is it's a very, very strict line, but it's really not based on race. So this is something that is new. The second thing I'll point out, and we'll look at this more closely in class, is the mixed people, if you will, mestizos and mulattoes. Within those categories, they start coming up with these unbelievably complex subcastes, if you will, where so if your dad is white and your mom is native, you are actually higher than if it's the reverse. And if you've got 2 white grandparents, then you are higher up than if you only have 1 grandparent and that's white. So there's all of these really unbelievably complex systems, subcastes, where they try to categorize everybody on a hierarchy according to how white you are, or not, as the case may be. And again, this is used in both the Portuguese territories of Brazil and in the Spanish American colonies. Final thing to point out about this, because the Portuguese Brazil was so reliant on sugar, their sort of fascination with this tends to be more on the right side of this social hierarchy, because again, the majority of Brazil is African slaves. The Spanish territories, where they took over large civilizations with huge native populations, tends to focus more on the left side of this hierarchy. So, again, these are the Iberian empires. Tomorrow, we'll look at the empires of the English, the French, and the Dutch. I want to thank you for paying attention, and I'll look forward to seeing you in class.